Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox. Delayed from Friday, now on Saturday. This is the 16th of July, 2011. My name is Totalbiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com. That's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com with topics for future shows. Let's cap off Team Fortress 2 week with some demo night gameplay. Oh yes, this is the demo man with melee kits, which is really hard to find a use for, I have to say. But it's been pretty fun, so here's a selection of gameplay from that. First email comes in from Joe D that says, anyone that isn't a fanboy will recognize the 3DS, Nintendo's latest handheld, is a very clever and fun piece of kit, with the 3D being an example of how a gimmick can reinvent the ideas on handheld consoles, with more and more devs giving 3D support. However, what are your thoughts on the focus of gimmicks such as 3D, motion control, and augmented reality? Do you think that console developers should work on decreasing the price of existing tech, making them viable for consoles, or continue broadening the gap between PC and home consoles? Well, I'm just going to ignore that question, and I'm going to talk about the 3DS and 3D in general, because that makes more sense, because I can't answer the rest of it, honestly. And I can tell you what my thoughts on 3D motion control and augmented reality is regards to whether or not console developers should work on decreasing the price of existing tech and things like that. No idea. Anyway, I'll talk about the 3DS, I'll talk about 3D in general. We'll start with the 3DS. The 3DS is a very nice piece of kit in terms of the fact that it is a good console. It's got a very nice interface. It's got a very nice set of controls. It's got the D-pad and the thumbstick, which is absolutely fantastic. I would like the D-pad to be a bit bigger, because I found that I had a lot of problems playing Super Street Fighter 4, for instance. I like to play Shotos, and I usually play with a pad. I actually play with a fight pad when I play Super Street Fighter Arcade Edition. But the actual D-pad is far too small, which is kind of dumb, because there's actually a lot of real estate that they could use. Let me go and get it for a second. I'm just going to go with my 3DS over here. Anyway, as I was saying, and shouting across the room, right here we go, right, so I'm just looking at my 3DS right now, and the D-pad could actually afford to be about 80% larger than it currently is, and it would still have a reasonable amount of leeway in between the screen and the edge of the actual machine. Aside from that, the interface is fine. It's got two very satisfying clicky shoulder buttons, which is good. It's got the 4 buttons X, A, Y, and B on the side, which also works really well. And it's got a good touchscreen. And this touchscreen is kind of designed for you to use your thumb with, really, as opposed to anything else. And you'll find that a lot of the gaming interfaces are designed around that, as opposed to stylus use, like on the old DS. It is a really nice machine. It's also very powerful. The thing is that the 3D, in my opinion, actually holds it back. For instance, I've got Dead or Alive Dimensions on this thing, and as far as I can tell, it seems to be running at about 60 FPS. That's what it looks like, anyway. There's no way for me to really tell that, because I don't have any way of accurately measuring the frames. But I am 99% certain that it's running at 60 frames per second. That is good. That is really impressive, honestly. And it plays really well. I was very, very pleased with that. And there's plenty of other examples of games that run really well on the 3DS. But the 3D handicaps the frame rate so hard. I mean, it literally cuts it in half on most games. Sometimes even worse than that. Any fighting game I would never play with 3D on, because what you want is a smooth 60 frames per second to play a fighting game. So things like Dead or Alive Dimensions and Super Street Fighter 4, you just don't play them with 3D on. There are very few games on the 3DS that really benefit from having a 3D mode. I think that Dream Trigger 3D is probably one of the only ones. Things like Resident Evil The Mercenaries don't really benefit from having 3D. Certainly, a lot of the launch titles don't benefit from having 3D. I mean, really, the best example of 3D use was Pilot Wings. It works fairly well for Pilot Wings because it gives you a bit of depth, so it actually helps you more accurately measure the distance. And this has been my experience with 3D on a proper system as well. I have a 3D television, the Samsung D8000, and the 3D on that uses active glasses, which are, needless to say, significantly better than passive and the stuff that's available on the 3DS. And the PS3 has a number of games which currently run in 3D. Now, I've played Wipeout, I played Killzone, I played Motorstorm. Racing games benefit from having 3D an awful lot, because not only does it enhance the sense of speed, it actually gives you a more accurate perception of the distance between where you are and where, say, the next corner is. I really like using 3D in racing games. For stuff like Killzone, it does make it a bit more atmospheric, but it doesn't really help the game in any legitimate sense. It doesn't help you judge distance like it would in a racing game. It doesn't give you an accurate relative positioning. But the 3D does look a lot better with active glasses and a good television than it would at, say, the cinema or on a 3DS screen. However, 3D mode on, say, a PS3 usually knocks any 1080p game down to 720p in pretty much every possible instance. And if it was already 720p, it's probably going to affect the frame rate somewhat, because it's basically having to render the game twice. And until they're able to get around that with some kind of clever coding, you're not going to find all that many games on the console which are preferable to play in 3D. There are some. Like I said, MotorStorm isn't really affected by it at all. I think it knocks that down to 720p. It still looks really good. Wipeout Fury isn't really affected either, because that's an older game anyway, so it wasn't using the full power of the system. Now, as regards to the other stuff, like motion control, again, motion control certainly has its uses. There are plenty of games that benefit from having it. I've espoused my particular desire to see a lot more shooters on the PS3 using the Move controller, because it's closer to a mouse and keyboard than, say, a traditional analog stick is. Some of it is a gimmick, like shake this to do this. Just go away with that nonsense. That is a waste of frickin' time and energy. There's no point in doing that, but motion controls can be good for certain genres of games, not so much for others. Augmented reality is the thing that I'm most interested in. One of the things I was really impressed with the 3DS was the augmented reality games that you could get. You actually got a set of cards. You put the cards down, turned on AR games, and all sorts of crazy things would happen. It's an amazing demonstration of the tech. Like, for instance, one of the cards will actually cause a large dragon to pop out of whatever surface you happen to be on, and it'll distort the surface as well. It looks really good, and you can actually strafe around it, and it'll render it in full 3D. You move your DS and yourself around it, and then you attack the dragon. It'll actually leave scorch marks on your table or whatever when you're playing it. That's incredible. I think there's all sorts of great possibilities for using augmented reality in the future. Admittedly, we haven't seen a huge number of those come out so far. Just the AR games that come with a 3DS, and I think the Pokédex is AR as well, if I recall correctly, that you can also get for that system. But I think there's a lot of potential in augmented reality. 3D is... I don't think it's going to be a fad. I think it will become more standard as we go through, particularly once passive 3D without glasses becomes a technology that makes sense in the home on a large display. And I don't see the problem with it being there. It's a good option for some games, not so much for others. As far as I'm concerned, it's a personal preference. It shouldn't really be forced on anybody, and it can enhance the experience for some people. For others, it's just a pain in the ass. This one comes in from Spyro that says, I've noticed more and more games using microtransactions as a funding source, which I find okay in smaller costs. For instance, Combat Arms, where it's about £1 for a week's use of a gun, or £5 for permanent use of it. However, I disagree with larger sums for lesser items, such as £25 for the Polycount pack in Team Fortress 2, and £10 for a skin in League of Legends. I realise it's the player's choice to buy these items, as you either do not need them to play the game, or they're accessible otherwise, but it seems too pricey, especially for Team Fortress 2. An example of good microtransactions are for Killing Floor, as they are only skins and cost less than £1 each. My question is, do you agree with developers pricing their microtransactions to this extreme, or do you think it is necessary for these businesses to survive when selling these games for so little or free? Well, it really depends on the nature of the game. I don't know a lot about Combat Arms other than the fact that it is a free-to-play game. I also know that League of Legends is a free-to-play game. Personally, I find Combat Arms system more offensive than League of Legends. And even though you're saying that Combat Arms is actually an example of a more reasonable system, I think the idea of renting a gun in a first-person shooter, that's effectively buying power. And I'm not really a huge fan of that. Unless, of course, it's properly balanced. I mean, maybe, and I don't know anything about Combat Arms, maybe it's just a case of you buy what's effectively a side grade. That's often the case with Team Fortress 2 as well. You've got a lot of items there which are not inherently better. There's a couple of examples where you can just say this is just better in pretty much every respect. The pros outweigh the cons. You should just be using this version, especially with the melee weapons. More often than not, the melee weapons tend to give you a nice bonus if you have one that's not the standard one. But in League of Legends, for instance, buying a skin, it doesn't affect the game in any way, at all. And Riot have done a good job of not allowing you to buy power. I think they've done a fantastic job of that. Hell, even with my 5,000 referrals, which I've now got, by the way, I've unlocked all of the content in the game, they still don't give you runes. So even after 5,000 referrals, they don't give you power. You have to earn that the way that you're supposed to. That's cool. I like that. As regards to the TF2 thing, I don't think it's that unreasonable, considering that, one, buying the Polycount pack actually supports the people that made those items. A lot of that profit is actually going to the people that made the items as opposed to going to Valve. So, to me, that seems more reasonable, and it's going to a lot of people, and there's a lot of items in that Polycount pack. Secondly, those items are available in-game anyway. Not only can you actually get them as random drops, but you can also craft them. So I don't really see it being a huge deal on that basis. To me, the Manconomy store is designed for those who want specific items but don't want to wait for the random element or don't want to wait to craft it. Even crafting is a little bit random. You can craft specific items, but sometimes it costs quite a bit, as opposed to, say, crafting a random one and hoping you get the right one, or maybe trading for it as well. I mean, there's like 3 different ways that don't involve paying any money at all to get these items: crafting, drops, and trading with other people. So I really don't see the problem with that. Yes, a lot of this stuff is expensive. There's no real question about that. And there are times when you have to wonder, well, is it really worth it? But it is a buyer's market, and it will bear what people are willing to pay for them. And I actually don't think that Valve is really interested in having everyone buy their items. And that sounds weird considering it's gone free to play, but I really don't think that's the case. I think, yes, they make a healthy profit off of it, but they would also like people to be able to get it in other ways. The only real problem I foresee in situations like that is when these items are just not available any other way, and that's when you start running into problems. When you have to pay for something that nobody else can get, which is inherently more powerful than something that they have available for free, that's when things start to get a little bit messy. Also bear in mind that I'm only really in support of these microtransaction DLC and virtual items if the game is 1, a free-to-play game, or 2, has been out for a sufficiently long time that we've got our money's worth out of the initial payment. For instance, if this stuff is like day 1 release, screw that. That's horrible. When it comes to Team Fortress 2, they gave us so much content for free that I felt that at the time the Manconomy update was reasonable. This was when you still had to pay for TF2. I did a video on this a while ago. I felt that that was all right. And now that it's free to play, I'm certainly okay with it. I'm not okay with games that require you to pay for them actually also having these things. That's not reasonable. It has to be a free-to-play game, or it's got to be out for ages. Like Killing Floor, for instance, they have provided so much post-release support that, as far as I'm concerned, the skin packs are a great way to give back to those developers. And, you know, Tripwire are not a big developer. They're an indie, so I think that's totally reasonable. It's how you do it. You know, it's the nature of... It's not the price, it's how you actually do it and what context you do it in, which determines whether or not it's an acceptable business practice. This one comes in from Luke Harper that says, "Hey TB, I was just reading this interview with Infinity Ward's community manager Robert Bowling, and he was speaking about how Modern Warfare 3 will have simplified and smaller maps from the previous incarnations of the game. I believe that Call of Duty 4 brought forward the idea that there were casual hardcore gamers out there, I like to call them, that actively played Call of Duty, especially on consoles, due to how simple it is to play, with such a rewarding experience for pulling the left trigger and then the right trigger. I was wondering if simplifying the game even more than before would turn away an audience that may have enjoyed the previous games in the series, but not enjoy the idea of a game being created for the people at the bottom of the scoreboard." I think it's absolutely going to drive away a fairly large audience. I would think that anyone that has even the slightest interest in proper competitive play for that game is going to be turned off by the idea that the maps are even simpler. And simpler and smaller maps, you cannot be serious. I mean, Black Ops had incredibly simplistic maps, to the point where you had a map called Nuketown. You've surely seen it. You can run across Nuketown in 20 seconds. It's really not that hard. It's such a stupidly small map, and as a result, there's no way you can have a really amazing game on Nuketown. It's a spam fest. It's for comedy. I go on Nuketown Domination to farm kills, and I don't believe that playing on Nuketown is legitimate in any real respect. It's hilarious, really, that the Call of Duty Elite advertisement, the big machinima that people saw maybe 2 days ago when it came out, was done on Nuketown. It's like, you really want to remind people about Nuketown? Seriously? It makes me believe that Call of Duty 3 is being marketed more and more at a younger demographic, which is extremely stupid, considering the amount of 25 to 36-year-old males that tend to play Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, and, of course, Black Ops. I don't know why they're trying to aim for a younger audience by just making these maps less complicated and smaller. I can't think of any other reason. Like, let's just reduce everything else that's interesting about the game, and let's just boil it down purely to shoot, get medals. You know, that to me is a childish thing. That to me is designing your risk-reward system solely for children in mind, because that's the kind of thing that kids like. Kids like gold stars. Why do you think there's been a system in schools for so frickin' long? Here, have a gold star. That's what Call of Duty is turning into. That's actually what made Call of Duty, in terms of its multiplayer, really starting from Call of Duty 4, an appealing thing. Because those things that pop up and say, hey, you're a marksman, or hey, you got 10 kills, here, have some experience, have a reward, have a gold star. That's what Call of Duty has become. That's why people go for their 10th prestige. They want the biggest gold star they can find. They just love it. They love seeing big shiny. They actually kind of need it. It's a compulsive thing, and it's applying to more and more multiplayer games, and quite frankly, I find that very disturbing indeed. The idea that you're going to shrink down the maps and simplify them just means that Call of Duty is going to become even more of a meat grinder than it was in the first place. And Black Ops is pretty bad for that, needless to say, with all of the back spawning and nonsense. The maps aren't very big or complicated in Black Ops either, so it comes down to a big meat grinder. You respawn in like 2 seconds with full health and ammo, you go right back into the fray. It's just a kill fest. It's a frag fest with very little skill actually involved in it. More often than not, it's about where you happen to be in relation to the guy who's got his back turned to you, or of course can't see you because he's got 55 FOV. Of course, that would only apply to the console version as opposed to the PC with Black Ops, but it certainly applied to Modern Warfare 2. God knows what it's going to do with Modern Warfare 3. Yeah, it's a disturbing trend, and I don't like it one little bit. I would certainly hope that games that are coming out do not follow that particular path. Battlefield 3 seems to be trying to differentiate itself. I'm hoping that it does so in a good way. And of course, there are games coming out like PlanetSide 2, which is going to have big, big maps. Oh yes, complexity is in PlanetSide 2. In fact, it looks like they're going to make it even more complex than the first game, which is brilliant. There's some great ideas in that, and also things like Dust 514. We've got games coming out like Tribes Ascend, so let's see how they turn out. Hopefully they'll be able to turn the tide in that particular regard, because God knows I'm not liking the direction of Call of Duty right now. Okay folks, that is me done for the day and done for the week. I will actually be back on Monday, since this was a particularly late mailbox. And we'll see what kind of game we want to play next week. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed TF2 week, and I will be setting up a server, hopefully this weekend, for Cynical Brit guys. The password will basically be put on the channel, so anyone that wants to come and play TF2 with the Cynical Brit guys, you can do that, and I will let you know once it's up and running. I'll see you next time.
Alert! The control point is being captured. Alert! The control point is being contested. The control point is being captured. Alert! The control point is being captured. You failed!